The city was falling asleep under the blanket of gray evening as the patrol car pulled slowly up to the deserted railroad tracks. Officer Larson, tall and composed, stepped out of the car, his face calm but his eyes tainted with irritation. He turned to the woman in the back seat. She sat strapped to the seat, her eyes full of fear, but her voice calm. "I just said I have rights," she said, trying to maintain her dignity. "Why are you doing this?" Larson narrowed his eyes, his face expressing a mixture of fatigue and irritation. "You think you can tell me how to do my job?" he replied coldly. "It's a warning. People like you forget their place too often." The woman continued to look at him, her gaze firm despite the circumstances. "It's not legal," she said. "You know that." Larson didn't answer, but his actions spoke louder than words. He opened the door, grabbed her hands, which were tied, and led her outside. She didn't resist, knowing that any attempt would only make things worse. "You want to be a heroine," he chuckled as they approached the tracks. "Let's see how far you'll go for your principles." It was a moment he considered his victory. He decided that her silent challenge was an insult to his authority, and now he had to show her who was boss. He tied her with a belt to one of the rails. His movements were quick and sure. "I'm just going to leave you here for a few minutes to think," he said, straightening up. "No one will get hurt if you figure out how this all works." The woman didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just looked at him with an expression that made his own confidence waver. Her calm wasn't what he expected. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "A very big mistake." Her words echoed in his head like something he didn't want to hear. Larson looked around, as if checking for witnesses, and returned to the car. He thought it was an easy way to teach a lesson, but something inside was already beginning to gnaw at him. He got into the car, starting the engine, but her words kept ringing in his head. A train whistle sounded faintly in the distance. Larson glanced nervously at the rearview mirror. A nagging feeling began to gnaw at him that he had gone too far, but he still tried to convince himself that he was right, that this was just nerves. The woman remained on the tracks, her face illuminated by the flickering lanterns. There was no fear in her case, only a quiet confidence that justice would find her offender. Larson sat in the car, his fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. The train's horn was getting louder, making him even more anxious. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. His gaze fell again on the woman, still tied to the tracks. She made no attempt to struggle, and her expression was calm, which was beginning to irritate him. "What? You think you're better than me?" he snapped, opening the car door and heading back to the tracks. "Sitting there like you have the right to tell me what to do." She looked up at him, her voice quiet but confident. "I'm no better than you," she said, "but I know for sure that what you're doing is wrong." Larson grinned, his face twisted into an evil grin. "Wrong," he repeated. "What's wrong is that people like you think you can dictate the rules. You always think of yourselves as victims, but you only create problems." His words sounded harsh, as if he was trying not only to humiliate her, but also to justify his own actions. But she continued to look at him, her gaze hard. "You can say what you want," she replied, "but the truth will come out, and you know it." The words hit him again, making him freeze for a moment, but he quickly suppressed the feeling, raising his voice to cover the sound of the train whistle. "Really?" His voice grew louder and more aggressive. "What real? That you're just another troublemaker who thinks the world revolves around her. You're not special. No one will care what happens to you." "You're wrong," she replied calmly. "People care, and you'll soon realize that." Larson frowned, her calmness a challenge he couldn't ignore. He stepped closer, leaning in to make his words sound even more threatening. "Do you think anyone will come for you?" he hissed. "You're alone here. No one will even know what happened to you if you decide to disobey." The woman raised her chin slightly, her voice full of dignity. "You're wrong, and you feel it. Otherwise you wouldn't be trying to intimidate me." These words again broke through his confidence, but he quickly hid it behind a new wave of aggression. "You must know your place," he said, taking a step back, "but it looks like you're going to have to learn it the hard way." His words echoed in the desert night. The sound of the approaching train grew louder, but instead of feeling triumphant, Larson felt something strange anxiety beginning to fill his mind. He turned away, trying to shake it off, but the woman's voice remained in his head, her confidence, her resilience. "The truth will find you out," she said behind him, her voice quiet but louder than a train whistle. Larson turned back to her, but said nothing. Instead, he headed back to the car, his steps quick and his thoughts jumbled. He sensed that this moment would be the beginning of something he could no longer control. Larson stood next to the car, looking at the woman tied to the tracks. The night air was growing colder, but his anger seemed to warm him. Hiding the anxiety that was beginning to grow inside him, he walked back to her, slowly now, with an expression on his face that was meant to inspire fear. "You should be grateful that I didn't go any further," he began, leaning toward her. "But it seems that gratitude is not to be expected from the likes of you." His words were mocking, as if he was trying to hide his own insecurity behind a false air of arrogance. The woman looked up, her eyes full of quiet determination, and it only made him angrier. "I won't thank you for the humiliation," she said calmly, "and you know it." The phrase struck a chord with his pride. Larson felt the rage inside him flare up again. He straightened up, looking around the tracks, as if searching for new ways to prove his superiority. "That's your problem," he said, taking a step back. "You always play the victim. You always think the world is against you. Or maybe it's not the world, but you." The woman was silent. She did not look away, did not allow him to see even a grain of fear. This silence irritated Larson more than any words. "Well, nothing to say," he continued, his voice growing louder. "Or do you think your principles will save you? Come on. Tell me about your dignity." She sighed, as if trying to remain calm. "My dignity is not in your hands," she said, her voice firm despite the circumstances. "You can scream, you can humiliate, but it will not change who you are." Larson frowned. The words had stung him again. They hadn't sounded like a threat, but there was a truth in them he didn't want to admit. Instead of stopping, he stepped closer, his face almost level with hers. "You think you can tell me how to live?" he hissed. "You're nobody, just a woman who thinks her loud voice means something." She didn't answer, but her gaze didn't dim. It made him even angrier. He wanted to see fear, submission, but instead he saw only resilience. "You don't even understand the situation you're in," he said, straightening up. "No one's coming for you. No one cares about people like you." He took a step back, hoping his words would finally break her, but her silence continued to haunt him. It was louder than any protest, stronger than any resistance. Larson felt his own confidence begin to crumble. He glanced around, as if to make sure no one could hear him, but the silence around him seemed deafening. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that his actions were already beyond his control. Meanwhile, the woman remained tied to the tracks, her face still dignified. It was a dignity that Larson could not break. It made him feel his own vulnerability, his own fears, which he tried to hide behind brutality and humiliation. In that distance, the sound of an approaching train was heard again. This sound was becoming a symbol of his own decisions, which now seemed irreversible. But the woman, even after hearing this sound, remained motionless, her gaze directed straight at him. "You can do whatever you want," she said finally, her voice calm, "but you can't run away from yourself." The words, as if resonating with his own fears, left him speechless. He turned away, taking a step toward the car, but the feeling that something was wrong continued to haunt him. Larson returned to his car, feeling increasingly uneasy. His movements were jerky, his thoughts chaotic. He glanced in the rearview mirror to make sure no one was around, but it seemed as if every shadowy figure in the distance was watching him. The silence around him was becoming more oppressive, and the train whistle, which was getting closer, was jangling his nerves. His phone rang, breaking the oppressive silence. A colleague's name appeared on the screen. He picked it up, but the voice on the other end of the line was anything but reassuring. "Larson, do you know what you're doing?" the voice began, not hiding its irritation. "We've received a complaint. Someone saw you by the tracks with a woman. This could end badly for you." Larson felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. A complaint? Who could have seen? He was sure no one was nearby, but the news made his heart beat faster. "It's all under control," he replied, trying to sound confident, but he couldn't hide the trembling. "They're exaggerating. I don't think the bosses will agree with this." The voice continued. "People are already filming this on their phones. You created a problem, and now you have to deal with it." With that, the call ended, leaving Larson even more anxious. He glanced toward the woman, who was still tied to the tracks. Her gaze remained unchanged, calm, confident, as if she knew that the truth would be on her side. "Do you realize what you've just done?" she said, her voice firm but not malicious. Your actions will not go unnoticed. Larson stepped closer, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and fear. Do you think you have the right to threaten me? He said, trying to maintain his power. I am the law here, and no one will come to your aid. But then he noticed movement at the edge of his vision. A group of people stood in the distance, their silhouettes blurred by the night light, but they were clearly watching what was happening. Larson felt panic begin to take over. These people could be witnesses, and their presence meant that his actions could no longer be hidden. Did you say something? He asked sharply, turning back to the woman, trying to regain control. I said the truth would find you, she replied calmly, and it seems to be on its way. The sound of the approaching train grew louder, but Larson could no longer concentrate. His mind was racing between the fear of being found out and trying to maintain the appearance of control. He glanced back at the group of people, who were growing larger. Some of them were holding phones, apparently filming the scene. Shit, he muttered, stepping back. This is getting out of hand. He walked to the car and tried to turn on the radio to call for backup, but his voice was shaking and he knew any excuses would sound weak. He had made a mistake he could not now correct. Meanwhile, the woman tied to the tracks remained calm, her gaze focused on the people in the distance. You see, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but Larson heard every word. This isn't just me. This is about how you treat people you don't like, and it has to end. Her words echoed through his mind. Larson felt his world crumbling. He was nothing more than a man trapped by his own actions. The shadows on the horizon grew closer, and the train grew louder. Larson stood near the tracks where the woman was tied up, his breathing heavy, his mind oscillating between the fear of being found out and the desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of control. His gaze kept drifting to the group of people who continued to gather nearby. The light from their phones trained on the scene like spotlights, illuminating his every move. He knew these videos could be used as evidence against him, but right now he didn't know how to stop. A voice inside him was telling him that the only way to stay in control was to keep pushing. He turned to the woman, still tied to the tracks. Her calm was eating away at him. Her gaze seemed to penetrate the depths of his soul, bringing out what he tried to hide even from himself. Larson moved closer, his shadow falling on her, and he leaned down so that her face was right in front of his. You think you've won? He asked, his voice low but sharp as a knife blade. You think these people are going to save you? They're just standing there filming. They're no better than you. Just a bunch of nosy people who can only complain. She didn't look away, didn't lower her eyes. Her voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it that didn't allow him to feel like a winner. They're not here to save me, she replied. They're here to see who you really are. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He clenched his teeth, trying to suppress the anger that was building. A storm was brewing inside him, a mixture of fear, rage, and the knowledge that he was losing control of the situation. He knew what she was saying was true, but he couldn't let it show. Shut up, he said, straightening up. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand anything. You're just... His voice wavered and he fell silent. He couldn't find the words to restore his confidence. He looked at the crowd again. There were more of them now, and their silence was becoming more and more judgmental. Every glance they gave him was a sentence. Every movement of the phone recorded his every mistake. You don't know who you're dealing with, he said again, but his voice was less confident. I'm the law here, and no one can tell me what I'm doing wrong. The law, she interrupted, her voice full of sarcasm. The law is not you. The law is what you fear. Larson felt something tighten inside him. The words were too close to the truth he was trying to ignore. He stepped closer to the woman, his face inches from hers. You think you're so smart, he hissed. You think your words mean anything. They mean nothing. You're nothing. Her gaze didn't waver. She continued to look at him with the same quiet confidence that was eating away at him. She was silent, but there was more power in that silence than in his words. It made him feel vulnerable in a way he had never felt before. I can end this right now, he said, stepping back. No one will know. You just disappear, and no one will even notice. Her face remained calm, but she spoke words that came as an icy blow to him. But you will know, you will remember, and it will destroy you. His hands shook as he turned away, trying to hide his emotions. The crowd behind him grew larger, their phones getting closer. Larson felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble. The sound of the approaching train grew louder, its roar filling the air, reminding him that there was no time to think anymore. But despite this, he felt that he had already lost, not to the woman, not to the crowd, but to himself. Larsen walked along the tracks, as if hoping the movement would help him collect his thoughts, but every step echoed in his head, mingling with the approaching rumble of the train. The crowd behind him, now large enough to seem a real threat, stood motionless, like a silent court ready to pass judgment. He could feel their eyes on him, as if hundreds of them were burning into his back, but he dared not turn. His own fear paralyzed him. The woman tied to the tracks watched him, her calm and natural in this situation. That was what irritated him most. He wanted to see fear in her eyes, submission, some small hint that she knew who was in charge, but instead he saw a confidence that bordered on defiance. Her silence said more than any words could. She knew something, and that knowledge made Larsen feel like he was losing control of everything that was happening. "Why are you silent?" he snapped, turning to her. His voice was shaking, but he tried to maintain a commanding tone. "Do you think that if you remain silent, it will change anything?" She raised her head, her gaze fixed on him. There was no fear or anger in that gaze, only firm confidence. "I'm not silent," she finally said. "I'm just waiting." Larsen felt the words seep into his mind, leaving a bitter sense of unease. Waiting for what? What could she be waiting for? He glanced around at the crowd, hoping to find an answer in their faces, but their looks only heightened his unease. They said nothing, but their presence was a condemnation in itself. "Waiting?" he asked again, his voice growing louder. "Waiting for what?" "For someone to come for you. No one will come. You're let alone. You're wrong," she said. Her voice was quiet, but each word was like a blow. "The truth always comes, and it's already here." The words sent a chill down his spine. Really? What did she mean? His mind raced, searching for an answer, but each option seemed more threatening than the last. He looked around, trying to find the source of his uneasiness, but saw nothing but the same motionless crowd and the sound of the approaching train. "Stop it," he said, his voice full of irritation. "You think you can scare me with your words. You won't achieve anything." She smiled slightly. The smile was barely noticeable, but it was enough to make Larsen feel even more vulnerable. "It's not me who's scaring you," she said. "You're scared of yourself." His rage flared up again. He moved closer, his face only inches from hers. "You don't know anything about me," he hissed. "Nothing. So stop playing these games." But she just continued to look at him, her gaze calm. He felt something inside him breaking. His confidence, his sense of power, it was all disappearing. He was no longer sure who was really in control here. Suddenly he heard a sound behind him. It wasn't the train. It was something else, like a rustling sound that made him freeze. He turned around sharply, but saw nothing. The crowd remained where they were, their faces now even more tense. They knew something he didn't. "What's going on?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. But no one answered. The woman seemed to know what was happening. Her gaze became even calmer, almost triumphant. Larsen realized that the game he had started was no longer under his control. Everything that was happening now was leading to something he could not predict. And this fear, this cold, inescapable fear, was stronger than anything he had ever felt. He heard the sound again, closer this time. His breathing quickened, and he began to look around. But the answer wasn't outside. It was inside, and he couldn't escape it. The sound grew louder. It was low, vibrating, as if it were coming from the ground itself. Larsen tried to locate the source, his eyes darting around, but he found nothing. The crowd in the distance had grown still, more than a group of people now. They were no longer mere bystanders. Their silence was becoming part of the horror, intensifying it. He turned back to the woman tied to the tracks. She looked at him with the same impenetrable confidence that no longer seemed like mere composure. It was something more, as if she knew what was going to happen. Her calm was eating away at him from the inside. "What are you up to?" he asked sharply, his voice shaking. "What do you know?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether to answer. "It's not me who knows," she said. "It's you's afraid of what's already happening." His heart sank. Her words were still unthreatening, but their meaning was heartbreaking. Something was happening, and he knew it. He could feel it. The hum was growing louder, but it wasn't just a sound anymore. It was something more, something intangible but incredibly real. It was a reminder that his actions had consequences that he couldn't run from. Larsen took a step back, his hand instinctively going to the radio hanging on his belt. He pressed the button, but instead of the familiar hum of the airwaves, He heard only static. The noise filled his ears, making him wince. This couldn't be a coincidence. Damn, he cursed, hitting the radio. Someone's jamming the connection. But no one answered. Only the woman tied to the rails continued to watch him. Her calm now seemed almost frightening. You're losing control, she said quietly. And that scares you. Shut up, he shouted, his voice full of anger. But that anger was a desperate attempt to hide his fear. You don't know anything. You just... His voice trailed off as he heard the sound again. This time it was a voice, a whisper that seemed to come from the air around him. It was impossible, but he heard it. The words were unintelligible, but they were there. He turned around, but again he saw nothing, just the crowd standing in the distance, and the woman, who was now smiling slightly. Do you hear? She asked. Her voice was quiet, but there was power in it. It's true. She's here. Enough, he cried, his hands shaking. It's just a game. It's all. But he couldn't finish the sentence. His own words sounded empty to him. He took a step back, but stumbled and almost fell. His breathing became heavy. He felt fear taking hold of him. You can do whatever you want, she continued, but the truth will always find you. It's inevitable. Her words echoed in his head. He looked at the crowd again. They were moving now, slowly but surely. They were moving toward him. It was not an aggressive movement, but there was something threatening about it. He took another step back, but his back was against the car. He was cornered, and there was no escape. The roar grew louder. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a feeling. It penetrated every cell of his body, making him tremble. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run, but he couldn't. All he could do was watch the crowd approach, the woman on the tracks continuing to look at him with the same calm. You lost, she said finally, her voice almost a whisper, but he heard every word, and you know it. Those words were the final blow. He felt his confidence finally crumble. Everything he had done, everything he had tried to control, was now turning against him, and he knew there was nothing he could do to stop it. Larson stood by his car, tense and wary, his gaze darting between the crowd that continued to watch and the woman tied to the tracks. He felt the weight of his actions beginning to weigh on him, like self-imposed iron shackles. His confidence, once unshakable, was cracking under the onslaught of reality. The sound of the approaching train grew louder, and every second brought the denouement closer. The crowd did not disperse. On the contrary, there were more people. They stood silently, but their looks spoke louder than any words. They condemned, they recorded everything on cameras. And Larson knew that these images were already spreading across the internet. He could no longer hide behind his power. Do you feel it? The woman asked, her voice even and calm. You're starting to realize that your time is up. Larson turned to her, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and fear. He wanted to say something harsh, but the words caught in his throat. Her calm felt like an insult, a reminder that she hadn't broken despite everything he tried. You don't understand, he finally said, his voice tense. I'm in charge here. I decide how this ends. You're wrong, she replied, her eyes meeting his. Your actions speak louder than your words, and you know it. Her words cut him like a dagger. He could no longer deny the obvious. The crowd, her gaze. The sound of the approaching train indicated that he had lost control. His fear intensified, turning into panic. You think you're better than me, he shouted, trying to regain some confidence. You think being right will change anything. Not my rightness, she said, her voice firm. But the truth, it's already here. He felt his breathing become shallow and ragged. Her words were like a resonance, adding to the pressure he could no longer ignore. He turned to the crowd, their silence deafening. Someone stepped forward, and Larson frowned, waiting for words. But the person simply held the phone higher to continue recording. It was humiliating. A reminder that everything he did was now on display. The sound of the train was already close, the whistle growing louder. Larson looked at the woman. Her calm seemed incredible. She did not beg, did not scream, did not resist. Her silence said more than any scream. You can stop, she said, her voice almost a whisper, but he heard every word. This is your chance. His hands began to shake. He knew she was right. He knew this was the moment he could change everything, but his pride, his fear, his anger, all of it kept him from making the right choice. He looked at the crowd again, and now he saw in their eyes not just condemnation, but expectation. They were waiting to see what he would do. At that moment, Larson realized that the choice was no longer in his hands. Everything he had done had led him to this moment, and he couldn't escape. He took a step back, his face turning pale as he realized that he had lost not only to this woman, but to himself. Larson stood by the tracks, his heart pounding so loudly it seemed to reach everyone around him. The crowd was silent, but their eyes were full of condemnation. The sound of the train was approaching, its whistle piercing the night, and the woman tied to the tracks continued to look at him with the same calm expression that was driving him crazy. She knew something he didn't. It was clear in her gaze, in her words, which were like thorns digging into his consciousness. But the next moment, the silence was broken. A tall man in a formal suit emerged from the crowd. His posture was firm, his face impassive. He moved confidently, his gaze fixed directly on Larson. The man approached, and with each step, Larson felt the ground slipping from under his feet. "What are you doing?" the man's voice said. It was deep and even, but there was a power in it that made Larson tense. Larson turned to him, trying to maintain his composure, but the man radiated such power that even his authority seemed insignificant. "It's none of your business," Larson snapped, trying to regain his confidence. "I'm doing my job." The man stopped right in front of him, his face calm, but his eyes blazing with cold fire. "Your job," he said, barely containing his anger. "You call this your job?" Larson felt fear creep into his heart. He wanted to retreat, but the crowd behind him and the men in front left him with no choice. The man turned his head and looked at the woman tied to the tracks. His face faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained control. "Take it off," he said, his voice firmer. "You don't understand what's going on here." Larson tried to justify himself. "This is a lesson. She needs to understand." "A lesson?" the man interrupted, his voice low and menacing. "You think you have the right to teach her? On what grounds?" The crowd was frowning, their eyes glued to the scene. Every phone was pointed at them, capturing every emotion, every word. Larson felt his pride and fear warring within him. "I don't have to report to you," he said, taking a step back. The man didn't move, but his gaze became even more piercing. "This is not a request," he said, each syllable a warning. "It's an order." Larson realized that this man was more than just the woman's husband. There was an authority in his posture, in his voice, that went beyond anything he could imagine. This man was clearly not someone to argue with, and it was this realization that made Larson flinch. But something in his mind still resisted. He took another step back, his hand reaching for his belt, for the radio. But at that moment the man approached him. "You've done enough," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Don't make things more difficult for yourself." The crowd began to move closer, and Larson felt the fear finally take hold of him. He turned to the woman. Her face was calm, but her eyes were certain that this was the end of his power. Larson looked at her, at the crowd, at the man who now stood next to him, and he knew he had no choice. But then something happened that no one expected. Larson stepped forward and began to untie the woman. His hands were shaking, and he felt the weight of everything he had done pressing down on him. He couldn't understand why he was doing this, but some part of him knew this was the only thing that could save him, at least partially. The crowd gasped. The man stood there, watching Larson's actions. When the woman was released, she looked at Larson with an expression that was a mixture of surprise and calm understanding. "You made the right choice," she said quietly. The man came closer. His face was serious, but there was no longer any anger in his eyes. "This isn't the end," he said, looking Larson straight in the eye. "You paid for everything, but you might as well leave now while you have the chance." Larson stepped back, his heart pounding. He knew the moment of truth had arrived. His power, his actions, everything he had built around himself was crumbling. He turned and walked slowly toward his car, feeling the eyes of the crowd on him. He knew this day would be the beginning of his end. Larson climbed into his car, slamming the door so hard the sound echoed across the empty street. His hands shook on the steering wheel, but he couldn't bring himself to start the engine. Behind him, he could hear the crowd whispering, their hushed voices adding to the feeling that the walls of his world were closing in. He realized that everything that had just happened had been recorded. It was no longer his secret. It was public knowledge. His breathing quickened, his heart pounding as if it would burst out of his chest. He glanced in the rearview mirror, where he saw the faces of the crowd. They were no longer mere bystanders. Their gazes were full of judgment. And then he saw the man saying one, who had just given him the order that had made him surrender. The man stood still, his face serious, but there was a threat in his eyes that Larsen couldn't ignore. Larsen instinctively reached for his radio, but remembered that it was still staticking. The sound, sharp and chaotic, seemed to mirror his own state. He slammed the radio against the dashboard, but it did no good. His hand slid back to the steering wheel, clenched into fists. He knew that all his usual instruments of control were useless. "Why did I do this?" he muttered under his breath, not daring to face the truth. But the truth was already behind him, in the form of the crowd, in the form of that woman who sat on the rails with such steadfastness that his own power seemed like a farce. He felt cold sweat trickling down his neck, and a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time was growing in his chest. Fear, real fear, paralyzing, relentless. His fingers trembled as he tried to start the car, but the key seemed stuck in the ignition. He tugged harder, but that only increased his sense of helplessness. A car, like everything else, refused to obey him. It wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of his life, which was now crumbling before his eyes. He looked in the mirror again. A man was approaching. Larsen felt his breath catch in his throat. This man was more than just the woman's husband. There was an authority in his walk, in his eyes, in his movements that Larsen could not dispute. It was not the authority of the law, but something deeper, stranger moral authority that forced Larsen to realize how far he had fallen. The man walked up to the car and tapped on the window. Larsen flinched, as if he had been caught off guard, even though he knew it would happen. He rolled down the window, his face pale. "Go away," the man said, his voice quiet but threatening, "while you still have a chance." Larsen tried to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. The man leaned closer, his face just inches from Larsen's. "You think you can escape?" he asked. "Everything you've done is already recorded. You can change it, but you can at least try to leave with some dignity." The words hit Larsen harder than any scream. He felt his confidence, his pride, dissolve, leaving only emptiness. He realized that he was no longer in control, and this fear, the fear of losing control, was greater than anything he had ever felt before. He started the car at last, and the engine roared to life, but even that didn't bring him relief. He looked at the man, then at the woman, who was now standing near the crowd. Her face was still calm, but in her eyes he saw not only confidence, but understanding. She knew he had lost, and her victory was so complete that Larsen couldn't even deny it. He stepped on the gas and drove away, but his fear didn't go away. He drove through empty streets, the man's words echoing in his head. Larsen knew his actions would catch up with him. It wasn't just the fear of being found out, it was the realization that he had become a prisoner of his own actions. Larsen sped through the empty streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his breathing heavy and ragged. Every second was a taunting reminder of what had happened, and that he could no longer escape the truth. He tried to concentrate on the road, but the curves seemed too narrow, the sirens too close. Even though no one was chasing him, it was his mind creating the illusion of pursuit, but he knew the real reckoning was already on the way. Meanwhile, on the train tracks, events began to unfold at lightning speed. The woman her husband had freed now stood in the center of a group of people, their gazes directed not at her with pity, but with respect. She raised her hand, calling for silence, and her voice, though calm, rang out loudly. "What happened here is not the end," she said. "It is the beginning. We must not remain silent about it." The crowd responded with cheers. Some began shouting words of encouragement. One person handed her a phone, which was already showing a live feed. The woman did not hesitate for a second. Her gaze became firm, her voice decisive. "Today I witnessed how far injustice can go," she said, looking directly into the camera. "But I will not remain silent, and none of us should. We know that truth is stronger than fear." Her words spread like wildfire across the internet. People in the crowd began sharing their own recordings. Every detail of that night was now being shared. The reaction was immediate. Comments, calls for justice, the first news articles, all of this became a weapon that a woman used to resist the system that was trying to break her. Meanwhile, the woman's husband approached her, his face a mixture of pride and relief. He took her hand, leaning slightly to say something just for her. "We will do it," he said quietly, but there was confidence in his voice. "They will answer for everything." She nodded, and in that moment, the woman realized that her fight was just beginning. But she was not alone now. There was a crowd around her, Her voice was amplified by hundreds of phones, and her story had been heard by thousands, and soon would be heard by millions. Larson, meanwhile, had arrived at his station, his steps heavy and his head down. He entered the building, but instead of the usual stares from his colleagues, he was met with a strange tension. Several people paused to look at him, then turned away to whisper quietly among themselves. Larson sensed that everyone knew his name was now linked to what had happened on the tracks, and no one was going to turn a blind eye to it. His boss called him into his office. Larson walked in, trying to maintain some dignity, but as soon as the door closed, his boss began talking. "Do you realize what you've done?" he said, his voice harsh and cold. "These videos are everywhere. You've put the entire precinct, our entire city, at risk." "It's a misunderstanding." Larson tried to justify himself, but his voice sounded weak. "A misunderstanding?" the chief asked, his gaze growing even more menacing. "You think this can be explained? You think everything that's on record will disappear?" "No, Larson, you violated everything that could be violated." The boss's words were like blows, each one shattering the fragile barrier Larson had tried to build around himself. He felt his world crumbling, not just his career, but his reputation, his confidence, his life all in pieces. Meanwhile, the woman and her husband gave an interview to the local news. Her story, told in her own words, was not an accusation but a call to action. Her calm voice and firm conviction inspired many. She became a symbol of how one person can stand up to injustice and change the course of events. When night gave way to morning, the world knew her name, and Larson knew his world would never be the same. Larson sat at his desk in the empty station. The silence around him was not relieving. It was heavy, suffocating. Every second felt like an hour, and it felt like the world he had built was crumbling before his eyes. The entire station seemed to have turned its back on him. Co-workers who had lunch with him the day before now avoided his gaze. And it wasn't just shame. It was deliberate contempt. On his desk was a printout of the article that had already made the rounds on the internet. The headline screamed, "Policeman ties woman to rails, exposing the system." His name was now linked to the event, and it was not respected, but hated. He couldn't take his eyes off the photograph that was attached to the article. It was of her, a woman standing in front of a crowd, her head held high, her husband by her side. They looked strong, despite everything that had happened. The photo wasn't just an image. It was a death sentence. The door to his office opened, and the boss came in again. His face was cold, his voice harsh. "Larson, this is the end. Do you understand?" he asked, not sitting down. "Complaints are coming in by the down scenes. People are demanding not only your dismissal, but also your arrest. The prosecutor's office is already studying the materials." Larson opened his mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. He knew he couldn't justify what he'd done. His excuses would sound like empty noise. "You need to leave," the boss continued, "and the sooner the better, because there's no room for you here anymore. Not here, not in this city." With that, the boss tossed a piece of paper on the tably notice of suspension. It wasn't just a document. It was the official end of his career, his power, his confidence. Larson looked down, feeling his hands begin to shake. It was over, and he knew it. Meanwhile, the woman who had become the face of resistance to injustice was giving another interview. Her voice was firm, but not malicious. She was speaking not to demean Larson, but to expose the system that allowed people like him to operate with impunity. "It's not just about him," she said, looking directly into the camera. "It's about how we can allow this to happen. It's about how important it is that we be heard." Her words resonated. People watched, listened, commented. She became a symbol, and her story inspired others. The crowd that stood that night was now a movement. People gathered for rallies, wrote letters, demanded change. Meanwhile, Larson was back home, if you could still call it home. His phone continued to buzz with calls and texts, but it didn't answer. Every text was an accusation, every notification a reminder that his life was now public, and no one was going to forget. He sat her down on the couch, his eyes blank. He remembered her face, her voice, her words. They were mean, but they were true. They were impossible to ignore. The next day, his name was in the news again. This time it was about a former police officer's being investigated. It was another blow, but he no longer felt angry. He felt only emptiness. The woman and her husband stood at yet another press conference. This time they were talking about hope, about how a movement can be born out of one tragedy. She was smiling, and that smile was a symbol of how truth, no matter what, can prevail. Larson closed his eyes, trying to block out the memories, but they wouldn't let him go. He realized he had become a prisoner of his own actions, and now all he could do was wait for the justice that was already on its way. The silence in the cell was absolute, but to Larson it was deafening. Every rustle, every distant footstep of the guards outside the wall, echoed in his mind like hammer blows. His Saturday on the hard bed had bowed, his hands shaking. Loneliness and fear were his only companions. The time he spent here seemed to stretch into eternity. He had no watch, but he felt every painful second. Voices could be heard outside the cell door. Larson tensed, his body instinctively tensing, as if he were expecting something inevitable. The sound of a key in the lock sent a wave of panic through him. The door slowly opened, and a guard stepped inside. "You have a visitor," he said in an indifferent tone. Larson looked at him, his eyes full of fear. Who could come here? Who would want to see him? The guard gestured toward the door, and Larson, feeling his legs tremble, stood up slowly. He was led into a small, concrete-walled room, where someone he hadn't expected was already sitting at a desk. It was her, the woman whose face he saw every night when he tried to sleep. She sat there quietly, her gaze focused on him, but there was no malice in it. Larson frowned, not knowing what to say, not knowing what to do. "Sit down," she said, her voice soft but firm. He sat down obediently across from her, his hands folded in his lap. Her presence seemed unreal to him. He expected hatred, but there was none. "Do you know why I'm here?" she asked, her gaze never leaving his. Larson was silent. He couldn't find the words. His pride, his confidence, everything was gone. All that was left was fear and guilt. "I'm not here to humiliate you," she continued, "or to see you suffer. I'm here to remind you that the truth always finds a way." Her words penetrated deep into his consciousness. She did not scream, did not accuse, but her calm was more powerful than any scream. He felt his fear grow into understanding, the understanding that he had lost not only to her, but to himself. "You have to understand," she said, her voice even but penetrating. "It's not just about what you've done. It's about what you can do next." Her words weren't just speech. They were a call, a chance for him to see himself from a different perspective. He felt something inside him break. It wasn't anger or despair, but something akin to remorse. He knew he couldn't change the past, but now he had a chance to at least try to make amends. She stood up, her gaze softening. "I don't hold a grudge," she said, "but I want you to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for everyone around you." Larson looked up, his eyes wet. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. She looked at him one last time and walked out of the room. Her footsteps echoed down the hall, leaving him alone with his thoughts. As the door closed behind her, Larson felt something new begin to form in his heart. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't relief. It was the beginning of a journey toward understanding. He knew justice had been served, but it wasn't just punishment. It was a chance to change himself, to start over. That day, he realized that truth and kindness always find their way, even if it requires destroying everything that was wrong. Dear viewers, what do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced injustice or discrimination? We want to know your opinion, because each of your stories is very important to us. Share your thoughts in the comments. We appreciate each of you and your support. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss new videos. Your activity helps us tell even more stories that really matter. We wish you a good day and remind you, together we can make the world a better place.